So as you're gathering in, I do want to say that we are very thankful for all our sponsors who are in our program. But in particular, I want to mention the Hallow app, which has given us a sizable donation, which we converted into a double sponsorship. We have two teachers, one right there, Geraldine, from the only classical high school in Ireland right now. Some of you may remember the name Claire Guernsey, now Claire McCarthy. She teaches there, bringing the Guernsey touch that we know so well at Donahue Academy to Ireland. So we have those two teachers there, thanks to the Hallow app sponsorship. And I also want you to know that the Hallow app is going to be doing a giveaway. Now this is, I know that sometimes that can be a little kitschy, as we heard in the lecture last night, but I don't think this one is. One of the things will be a copy of Beauty in Light of the Redemption by Dietrich von Hildebrand. Another will be a free year of the Hallow app, and another will be a print of a painting from one of the Saints in 7 Days series. So I don't think that that's kitschy stuff, so you want to stick around for that giveaway. That will be after Professor Serrallo's talk. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Daniel McInerny. He is Associate Professor and Chair of the Philosophy Department at Christendom College in Front Royal, Virginia. His scholarly work focuses on the philosophy of art, beauty, and creativity. His most recent book, Beauty and Imitation, a philosophical reflection on the arts, appeared from Word on Fire Academic in 2024, a book which Dr. Peter Kreeft called, quote, the best book on beauty I have ever read. But Dr. McInerny's interest in the arts and creativity is not only academic, he is also the author of a novel, The Good Death of Kate Montclair, published in 2023. And that was how my wife and I kind of first encountered Dr. McInerny's work. It's a really good novel. It starts as, it's a little quirky first, just telling Daniel there, but it really develops and it kind of has an Agatha Christie feel and culminates with a kind of a pro-life message. It's beautifully done. And it's within that, when you start reading his book on beauty, you'll see that's kind of a reflection on Aristotle's Poetics. So it gives us a chance in this conference to think about literature and beauty. Dr. McInerny thinks in a more popular vein, a novel about art, beauty, creativity, and culture in his Substack newsletter, The Comic Muse. Though Dr. McInerny has over 20 years experience in college and university classrooms, he's also a veteran high school teacher and homeschooling dad. This morning, he's going to bring his experience and expertise to bear on a topic of supreme relevance to Catholic classical education. By the end of his talk, he promises, you will have learned the nature of poetic experience, its connection to beauty and to truth, and how an education highlighting poetic experience can transform the hearts and minds of the students in your classrooms, thus inspiring them to become passionate, lifelong learners, fueled by a rich, easily replenished sense of wonder. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel McInerny.
Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are what is wanted in life. Plant nothing else. Uproot everything else. You can only form the minds of rational animals with facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I raise my own children. This is the principle on which you must raise your children. Stick to the facts. Now, those are the opening lines, as you may know, of Charles Dickens's novel, Hard Times. And they are spoken by this fellow, Mr. Thomas Gradgrind, who is, whoops. What do we got? Oops, this is a little stuck right now. There we go. This man, Mr. Thomas Gradgrind, he's something of a school superintendent. And when the novel opens, again, those are the opening lines of the novel, Gradgrind is visiting this school. And those lines are spoken to the schoolmaster. And obviously, as you can see, he is quite an intimidating man. And he's hearing the children recite, and he likes what he hears, but he wants to hammer home his message, his educational message. It's all about teaching children facts and nothing but facts. So at one point, he asks a little girl to stand up, and she has a wonderful name. Dickens is always wonderful with names. Her name is Sissy Jupe. And he asks Sissy Jupe to stand, and he says, girl number 20, right? It's a waste of time to call children by their names, right? Far more efficient to simply give them numbers. He says, girl number 20, tell me what a horse is. Sissy Jupe is actually new in the school, and she has no capability of defining what a horse is. And so she just stammers, she's embarrassed, she doesn't know what to do. And Gradgrind explodes. He says, I have a little girl here who doesn't know what a horse is, something as commonplace as a horse. And he tells her to sit down, and he calls on a boy, and for reasons I don't quite understand, he knows the boy's name. And he says, Bitzer, stand up. Tell me what a horse is. And this is how Bitzer answers. Quadruped, gramnivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, and 12 incisive. Sheds coat in the spring. In marshy countries, sheds hoofs too. Hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with iron. Age known by marks in mouth. Thus, and much more, Bitzer. Bitzer just rattles off facts about horses. Gradgrind and the schoolmaster have turned him into something of the chat GPT of 19th century London. He's just, you ask him something, he will spit out the facts, right? And Gradgrind and the schoolmaster, of course, are so proud of Bitzer. Gradgrind ends with a flourish. He turns to Sissy Jupe and says, now you know what a horse is. Does she? I'd like to ask you this question. If you had never been around horses before, and this afternoon you were going to get on a horse for the first time, and you have your choice of 2 instructors, Bitzer or Sissy Jupe, who would it be? Now, the thing you have to know about Sissy Jupe is, her great secret is she actually does know a lot about horses in this sense. Her father trains horses in the circus. So who would you want? Would you want Bitzer with all his, rattling off of facts about horses, or would you like Sissy Jupe if you actually needed someone to instruct you how to get on a horse and get off safely? I know who I would choose. What I want to suggest to you today is that Sissy Jupe is not ignorant of horses. Far from it. She has knowledge of horses, and I want to underscore, she has real knowledge of horses. She doesn't have Bitzer's knowledge. She doesn't have what Gradgrind thinks is scientific knowledge of horses. She doesn't have what we would call today equine science. I don't even think Bitzer has equine science, but he's sort of tending in that sort of direction. Sissy doesn't have that, but she has knowledge, and it's a kind of knowledge that I will be calling with you today. It's not a phrase I coined myself, but we're going to call it poetic experience. It's also been called poetic knowledge, but today I'm going to call it poetic experience. It's real knowledge, right? And as Tyler said, I think it's of supreme importance to the work that you're doing in the classroom. And I hope to explain why as we go along. First off, though, I want to underscore more how the culture that we're living in, including our educational culture, is a culture of grad grinds gone mad. I want to touch on what I take to be 3 chief characteristics of our culture that impact all the families that of the children that you teach, that impact every sector of our culture. And I just want to go through them pretty quickly. Lots of qualifications need to be made, lots of elaborations. I'm not going to go through all that. I just want to kind of name these 3 characteristics of our culture, which make it so much the kind of materialist, reductionist, hyper-rationalistic culture that we're now living in. Right? And it has these 3 characteristics. It can be described, first of all, as a left hemisphere tyranny, driven by an ideal of authenticity that often crashes into the reality of narcissism. Let me just, again, very briefly explain what I mean by these 3 characteristics. So when I talk about left hemisphere tyranny, I'm drawing on the work of this man whose work I hope you know. If you don't, please be introduced to it today. This is the philosopher and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist. In 2009, he published this book, The Master and His Emissary. His thesis boils down to this, and again, lots of qualifications need to be made, but I'll just get right to the pith of it. What McGilchrist argues is that our culture is defined by a tyranny of left hemisphere modes of thinking. You've probably heard that we associate the left hemisphere of the brain with logic, right? Analytical thinking, and we associate the right hemisphere of the brain with intuition, etc. That's basically McGilchrist's thesis, though his defense of it, I think, is very fresh and new, compelling, provocative. The problem with our culture, again, McGilchrist says, is that it has become a tyranny of left hemisphere modes of thought. And I prefer to talk about left hemisphere modes of thought because I don't equate mind with brain activity. That's another talk for another day, but I'll just tag that right now. So thinking is not brain activity, but brain activity is certainly part of the condition of thinking. And so there are left hemisphere modes of thinking. This is grad grind. This is what he's making Bitzer into, right? Left hemisphere modes of thinking are modes of analysis, right? So you know that English word analysis comes from the Greek verb luo, literally meaning to loosen, a little less literally to break down into its parts. That's what we do when we analyze. We break things down into parts. That's what Bitzer does to the horse. He breaks the horse down into bits, not digital bits. That's what we do in the 21st century. But in the 19th, he's breaking the horse down into bits that he has been taught to call facts. Again, in our culture today, that left hemisphere mode of analysis is dominant and tyrannical. Right hemisphere modes are taken to be soft, a little squishy, fun for poets, but not really what's needed if we're going to chug along the path of progress that we hope to chug along in the modern world. So McGilchrist has taught us to think about culture as tyrannized by left hemisphere modes of thought. I would call grad grindian modes of thought. Right? So that's That's just a rough breakdown of the strengths of the two modes of thinking of the two hemispheres. So you see the right hemisphere associated with intuition, holistic perception, creativity, metaphor, even humor come along with right hemisphere modes of thought. And the left hemisphere, as you see, unsurprisingly, with ordered sequencing, analysis, logical argumentation, etc., etc. Right? Now go back to the title of McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. His point is that the right hemisphere modes of thought ought to be the master. Those modes of thinking ought to be dominant. Left hemisphere modes, we don't want to get rid of them, we can't. Left hemisphere modes should be the emissary, in other words, the administrator of the vision that we get with right hemisphere modes, right? And the image I like especially of right hemisphere modes working well with left hemisphere modes is the image or metaphor of the dance. So there you have Fred and Ginger. Fred, for my purposes, our purposes today, represents right hemisphere modes, those intuitive, holistic modes. Ginger, for our purposes, represents left hemisphere modes. They work together. It's not either or. They work together. It's a dance, but as with any dance, you're going to have someone taking the lead. And that's Fred. That is right hemisphere modes. That is not how our culture perceives thinking in the first place, let alone the relationship between the hemispheres. In fact, I want to mention this author too. This is Neil Postman. Perhaps you've heard of him. Perhaps most famous for a book, I think, that came out in the 80s on television. This book, though, I really appreciate. I use it in my course on the philosophy of culture. It's called Technopoly. And Postman's thesis, although he was writing before McGilchrist, is very much congruent with it, in that he says that, yeah, instead of saying we live in a left hemisphere tyranny, Postman says we live in a technopoly. Technological thinking is right hemisphere mode thinking, right? And that mode of thinking dominates every facet of our culture, argues Postman, right? Including religion, he says. There is nothing that has not become in some way technologized, right? Grad grind is now dominant. Okay, that's one feature. Let's talk about a second feature of our culture, the ideal of authenticity. I think this is the moral ideal of our culture today, mainstream secular culture today. It's driven by this ideal of authenticity. So here, some of you may know, I'm drawing on ideas of the philosopher Charles Taylor. But I'm going to make a beeline to this more popular figure, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs gave a commencement address at Stanford University in 2005. If you've never watched it, watch it. It really gives you an insight into authenticity, into our culture. At the climactic, Jobs was dying of cancer at the time. He didn't think he was dying, but he was. And so it makes it a very poignant moment. This is the climax of his remarks to the Stanford graduates that day. He says, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. He's calling on the graduates to live authentic lives. And that metaphor, listen to your own inner voice, is the key one. who you are supposed to be as a human being is to be found on the inside. Right? You have to find that voice, and it might be obscured, drowned out by dogma, says Steve Jobs, right? By the voices of your parents, by the voices of your teachers, other cultural influencers. You have to just push all those competing voices away and find that still, quiet inner voice, who you are truly meant to be. That's authenticity for Jobs. And you can see he's drawing on right hemisphere modes of looking at the world. He talks about, as I do today, he's talking about the heart. He's talking about intuition. Right? This is the technologist of technologists, but he's calling upon the heart so that we can find authentic lives. I think if you talk to many people, perhaps many younger people today, you're going to find them driven by this ideal of authenticity, even though they may not use that word, authenticity. They're trying to find who they're truly meant to be. Okay. Think about it, though. That's a big ask. Go find your most authentic life. Go find who you're truly meant to be. Craft your own, manner of existence. I mean, that's a big assignment. And so I don't think it's surprising that a lot of young people in our day feel the weight of that assignment. Right? It sounds great, that kind of freedom. But to exercise it in a world that's not really designed to accommodate you very easily is an awful lot of work. And I think that's not the only cause of the mental health crisis we see today, but I think it's certainly a cause. Young people are simply overwhelmed by this ideal of authenticity, and so they experience narcissism. Now, careful, I'm using narcissism in a fairly technical, very specific way. I don't simply mean someone who's full of himself. That's not quite how I'm using narcissism today, and I'm drawing on the work of the cultural commentator Christopher Lasch, who was a big name in the 80s and 90s. Not so much today, but his book's still very, very much worth reading. Lasch argued that we live in a culture of narcissism. Narcissism, yes, you're self-concerned, but you're self-concerned with a twist. You're self-concerned because you're having trouble living out that ideal of authenticity. You can't find that inner voice. You can't hear it. And you're feeling vulnerable, fragile, inadequate. That's the narcissism that Lasch wants us to think about. And again, I think that is a chief characteristic of the culture that we live in today. Left hemisphere tyranny, the ideal of authenticity, narcissism. That's what happens to a culture when you let the grad grinds have their way. Right? And so I want to now go back to Sissy Jupe and see if we can learn, in a way, paradoxically, from her ignorance, or her seeming ignorance, and learn more about the kind of knowledge that she has about horses, and whether that can help us think a little better about what it means to teach, to learn, and indeed to build a culture. I bet you know this book by C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, especially the first lecture, Men Without Chest, and probably that key quotation from the same. Lewis concludes, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. Bitzer is a desert in the 19th century, but our young people living in Technopoly, trying to live the ideal of authenticity, but crashing back into narcissism, they're living in a far more desolate desert. So how are we going to address that? Here we go. We need Sissy Jupe's form of knowledge. That's what Pope Benedict XVI is talking about in this passage here. This is an address he gave to the group Communion and Liberation back in August of 2002. It's beautiful. It's called The Feeling of Things, The Contemplation of Beauty. If you've never read it, you can find it easily online. It's absolutely wonderful. Pope Benedict writes this: being struck and overcome by the beauty of Christ, of course he's thinking theologically, is a more real, more profound knowledge than mere rational deduction, left hemisphere modes. Of course we must not underrate the importance of theological reflection, and I would add left hemisphere modes in general. Of course we must not underrate them, of exact and precise theological thought. It remains absolutely necessary. But to move from here, to disdain or to reject the impact produced by the response of the heart in the encounter with beauty as a true form of knowledge would impoverish us and dry up our faith and our theology. We must rediscover this form of knowledge. It is a pressing need of our time. That's what's motivating me to give these remarks to you here this morning, because I also feel this is a pressing need of our time to recover, rediscover this encounter with beauty as a true form of knowledge. Right? We need perhaps more authority. Here we go. Here's St. John Henry Cardinal Newman in his essay in aid of a grammar of assent. Very famous passage from that book. Newman writes, again, speaking of the heart, everybody goes right to the heart. The heart is commonly reached not through reason, but through imagination, by means of direct impression, by the testimony of facts. I think he's using that term in a little different way than Gradgrind. We might talk about that later. By the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description, persons influence us. Voices melt us. Looks subdue us. Deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion, that is, for the conclusion of a syllogism. No one, I say, will die for his own calculations. He dies for realities. That's what poetic experience gives us, realities. It gives us persons, voices, looks, deeds, things, reality. And again, that's what Sissy Jupe has. That's what Bitzer does not have. All right. Another authority on poetic experience, I don't have a picture of him up here, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I bet some of you, if not all of you, are aware of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. It's a page long if you've never read it. It's a very quick read. It's very inspiring. And just like Pope Benedict, just like Cardinal Newman, Solzhenitsyn is talking about poetic experience. He doesn't use the phrase. But the address is entitled Beauty Will Save the World. He takes that from Dostoevsky's Prince Mishkin, from Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, and he ruminates on that in his acceptance speech. And for Solzhenitsyn, again, he sees it as a pressing need of our time to rediscover the power of beauty, especially in great art, to change lives. He says something very interesting that I actually just noticed, and I'm still puzzling over it. For Solzhenitsyn, it's actually a work of philosophy. It's actually a work of what Pope Benedict called a work of rational deduction that can actually fool us, seduce us into something that's maybe only a half-truth at best. But the beauty in a great work of art, it's that the truth that it delivers to us can't be faked, Solzhenitsyn argues. It's unanswerable. It's undeniable, right? And so it provides a kind of authority that we don't have when we are thinking solely according to left hemisphere modes. In the same way that Sissy Jupe has an authority in her knowledge of horses that Bitzer, with all his facts, doesn't have. Okay. So Solzhenitsyn plays on that phrase, beauty will save the world, from Dostoevsky. I just want to tweak it, I think, very much in the spirit of Solzhenitsyn, and perhaps Dostoevsky too. And I want to say beauty in poetic experience will save the world. So it's not beauty, it's not just the beautiful painting hanging on the wall of the National Gallery that's going to change the world. It's a person being in the presence of that work, enjoying that work, contemplating that work, being moved by that work. That's what changes the world. Beauty in poetic experience will save the world. So I want to unpack this thought a little bit more in three ways. First of all, I want to define a little bit more precisely what poetic experience is. I am aware of the ironies here, that I am being philosophical with something that is inherently an experience and not philosophical thinking. So I am going to destroy the poetic experience of poetic experience by being a little philosophical about it. But I think that will help us a little bit get clearer on what I mean. Then I want to talk about the special role, the call of beauty in poetic experience, and then talk about the way of imitation, how that arises within poetic experience. And then I want to send you away with some more practical principles and takeaways at the very end. Okay. Let's take a walk then with Gerard Manley Hopkins, S.J., Jesuit priests, poets. I seem to be giving you a bibliography today. Another great thing to read, just for the sheer joy of it, are Hopkins's journals. And you find, when you read Hopkins's journals, what a great nature lover he was. He loved to take walks in nature, and he loved to record with very close noticing what he saw in nature. I think what we find in Hopkins' journals is just a great example of poetic experience at work, at play, we should say. Right? So one day, Gerard Manley Hopkins was on a walk, May 11, in fact, 1873, and he noticed some bluebells. I know that type is a little small, so I'll read it for you. Just notice as I read this passage how close the noticing is. How you, not only would you have to have put away your phone, but you would really have to relax into the moment to see these bluebells in the way that Hopkins is seeing them. So he writes, bluebells in hotter wood, all hanging their heads one way. Isn't that nice? You can see that. I caught as well as I could while my companions talked the Greek rightness of their beauty, the lovely, what people call gracious bidding one to another or all one way, the level or stage or shire of color they make hanging in the air a foot above the grass, and a notable glare the eye may abstract and sever from the blue color of light beating up from so many glassy heads, which like water is good to float their deeper in stress in upon the mind. Wow, that's contemplation. That's poetic experience. Right? Like Sissy Jupe's love of horses, Hopkins loves the outdoors, and he's loving these bluebells. And so he simply wants to remain in their presence, soak up their beauty, not just on the sensory level. Right? It's not that he's just looking at the bluebells. He's contemplating the bluebells. Notice the kind of comparisons he makes. He talks about they're all hanging their heads one way. That's already metaphor. Metaphor, right hemisphere mode of thinking. But it's thinking, not just sensing at that point, to see that metaphor. Or when he talks about the Greek rightness of their beauty, he's taking his knowledge of art history and he's applying it to these bluebells right in front of him. Wonderful, wonderful. You don't have, I would say, education. You don't have culture until you have this kind of close noticing, this kind of poetic experience. You don't have, ultimately, this. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color, like a brinded cow, for rose knolls all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finch's wings, landscape, pieced and plotted, fold, furrow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whether fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Pretty nice poem. That's Hopkins's sonnet, Pied Beauty. He wrote it in 1877. Not so much about these bluebells alone, but about the pied, that is the varied nature of beauty that we find in the world. The construction of a poem is not just poetic experience. It's not just right hemisphere modes of attending. It's not just love and intuition in the heart. You need the emissary, the administrator, to come along and think through the construction, to execute the construction. As you may know, with Hopkins, he was to his mind, a kind of inventor of a meter, right? He called sprung rhythm. And he wrote essays about sprung rhythm that are very kind of left brain, we might say. They're very analytical. So the left hemisphere modes of thinking come along in the dance, in the writing of the poem. But what's fueling the composition is the original poetic experience. And I think that's the very experience we want to invite our students to have. There's Pied Beauty. Okay, I missed one word. All right, let's define poetic experience a little bit more precisely. Poetic experience occurs when we enjoy a consummation, a loving union with a beautiful particular. That's what's key. The union is foremost with a particular. Ideas might be involved, but the union is with a particular, not with the dictionary definition of bluebells, but with those bluebells that Hopkins saw on his walk. A consummation that involves our senses, exterior and interior. Right? So I'm drawing on Aristotle and Aquinas here and talking about interior senses, including imagination. Imagination is actually a sense power. It's not the mind, it's a sense power. Memory is a sense power. We need internal senses as well as external, our emotions, our mind and will, they don't turn off. We need all of us, in short, to be involved in this consummation with the beautiful particular. That's what I would say poetic experience is. I think C.S. Lewis, to return to him, is also talking about poetic experience in this passage from The Weight of Glory. He says, but we want so much more, something the books on aesthetics take little notice of. But the poets and the mythologies know all about it. We do not merely want to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty that we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become a part of it. Right? Those metaphors at the end really capture what poetic experience is all about. It's that bathing in it that inspires the poem and inspires the learning, I think, in any discipline. Okay. Just a word. Poetic experience, I hope it's been clear, though I did use Hopkins as an example. Poetic experience is not just about poetry. It's not just for poets. It's not even just about art. You can have a poetic experience pretty much anywhere at any time. Because what it is, essentially, it's an act of love, it's an act of attention. So I put an image here of two women having coffee. You can have a poetic experience having coffee with a friend. Maybe not the coffee that you're slamming down because you're late for work. But if you meet a friend and you have the time to have real conversation and you revel in that intimacy, there is a union with the beloved particular. That is, that kind of experience we can have a lot, if not all the time. The best kind of poetic experiences, though, are not always with bluebells. I think they're with people. That's why we remember the wedding more than we remember the hike in the woods, right? Or if we had to rank them, we'd rank the family wedding above even the wonderful hike in the woods, because it's with persons that poetic experience is most vivid, most life-changing. Okay, let's talk about the call of beauty a little bit. I'm going to draw on some ideas from Aquinas here, from the Prima Secundae of the Summa. St. Thomas Aquinas never wrote a treatise on beauty. Whenever he talks about beauty, it's kind of an aside. His focus is on something else, and then he drops this stunning gem about beauty in the midst of it. And so what scholars have done is they kind of collected the gems, and they've tried to piece together, I know I have, tried to piece together his thinking about beauty. What's really interesting, and it's another discussion for another day, is that when St. Thomas defines beauty in the Summa, he's not talking about art, he's not talking about the natural world, he's talking about Christ. He's talking about the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. Beauty has its ground in Christ, certainly, but we might also say in intelligibility, in the meaning of things. Poetic experience calls us with beauty. The beauty of those bluebells called Gerard Manley Hopkins. The beauty of the horse called Sissy Jupe. The beautiful attracts and calls us. It's calling us, though, to what we philosophers like to call an act of cognition, an act of knowing, right? Learning something about the world, apprehending something. Beauty is a delight in the goods of apprehension or cognition, but on two levels. We can take in the world through our senses, and we can take in the world through our mind. And what's wonderful about beauty is it gives us both cognitions at once. Beauty, as I tell my students, is the perfect sandwich for us as human beings, right? It's both sensible and intelligible at the same time. So that if I told you, hey guys, I'm gathering people to come over to my house on Friday night, we're going to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I go, okay. Right? We'll see if I'm free. May not be free though. Check the calendar on that. But if I say, hey guys, I'm having people coming over Friday night, we're going to watch a movie. Like, okay. Right? Because the movie is more con-natural to us. It fits our nature better as embodied spirits. Because you know there's a movie you can sense. Your mind's not going to turn off. I hope not. But you're going to take in meaning through the senses. That's what makes beauty so special to us. And that's what makes poetic experience so special to us, because it always involves beauty. Now, a quick qualification. We talk about beauty as giving us meaning. But it doesn't, again, give us the kind of meaning we get when we are pursuing science at a very high level or pursuing philosophy at a very high level. It gives us a meaning that's, well, more poetic. And it's going to be a little vaguer because of that, but still extremely powerful. Here's an example. This is an example I got from a strange source. I found this in a book review, a pretty obscure book review, where the author was talking about poetic experience, and he uses this example, and I love it. And I don't know if he made it up or if it's something he read or heard, but he's thinking of somebody who is observing warfare in the trenches. I take it in World War I. So that's a picture of no man's land in World War I. And he's imagining somebody either looking at a picture or maybe being on the spot and just having this poetic thought, man is a dirty animal. Right? That is not a philosophical definition of the human person. I teach a course on the human person. I don't teach that definition of the human person, right? It's not scientific, it's not philosophical, it's comes from the gut, it's more intuitive. But I would say it's real knowledge. Man is a dirty animal. That's a very powerful metaphor. And you can see it's already poetic, and it could be the germ, perhaps, of a poem. It's the beginning of wisdom. That's how we pick up the world through beauty. That's how we pick up the world through poetic experience. Right? So now we need left hemisphere modes to supplement, so that we can do science, we can do philosophy, we can do literature, we can do history in a more systematic, more rigorous way. But again, just as with Hopkins's poem, all of that administrative activity is fueled by the original poetic experience. Okay, say a word about imitation. So we've defined poetic experience a little bit. We've talked about how it's a call of beauty. And now I want to talk about how it's a way of imitation. I think it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who said, we become what we love. We become what we love. That's how I read that photograph there of the little boy imitating his daddy. He's trying to become what he loves. He's imitating. Right? We all, as human beings, imitate. We don't need to learn how to imitate. It just comes naturally. Aristotle talks about this at the beginning of his Poetics. He says, all human beings take pleasure in imitating, and he remarks, it seems to be in part because we pick up knowings through imitation. That is, we learn about the world through imitation. That little boy is not putting it that way to himself at this point. He's just following daddy. But he's learning about what it means to be a man by imitating his father. Let's go back to Ian McGilchrist. Still in The Master and His Emissary, he contends, imitation is a human characteristic and is arguably the ultimately most important human skill. a critical development in the evolution of the human brain. Imitation is how we get to know what we know, but also how we become who we are. And my point is that a poetic experience inspires imitation, right? Calls us to be more like that beautiful particular that we are enraptured by. Okay. Some final tips, takeaways that perhaps might enhance your classroom. Before I get to particulars, I want to cite some principles about poetic learning or bringing poetic experience into a classroom. And I would first of all say that the lesson, the activity, must be grounded in the external senses. That's where you always begin, right? If we get too cerebral, too analytic, too quickly, the eyes tend to glaze over, right? We need some sensory input. It needs to stimulate a proactive imagination. There's the internal sense, imagination. So the activity in some way must create images, right? Concrete images. It should be founded in story. That doesn't necessarily mean a work of literature. It could be history, right? But somehow there is a grounding in narrative, right? It must summon love. Again, two-tiered, as we saw with beauty, both on the sensible level and on the rational level. It must involve play, wonder, curiosity. Not always, but I would think often it should produce an artifact. It doesn't have to be the kind of robot that this fellow is building, right? It could be a sonnet. It could be a skit, could be a play. But something is made, and I think it helps if the hands are involved, so there's a tactility to it. Our body is engaging. And, as we just saw with the importance of imitation, imitation exercises, I think, are a key component of poetic learning. So what are some particular examples then? These examples are taken from my experience. I have no doubt that you got better ones, and I would love to hear about them and put more arrows in my quiver. But here are things that I have used. I use an exercise in more than one of my elective classes at Christendom College that I call the Commonplace Book Project. The Commonplace Book was something that was popular more in the 19th century. It wasn't so much scrapbooking, and it wasn't a diary. It was kind of in between. You would journal a poetic experience. You would keep key quotations from your reading. Things that really moved your heart, you would keep in the Commonplace Book. And so this is a Commonplace Book from one of my own classes. A young woman, Audrey Spire, made this Commonplace Book, and she allowed me to take some pictures of it. And it is stunning. I know you probably can't read those words. I don't expect you to, but I read these Commonplace books from my student, and I keep the hanky close by. They are just so moving as they are engaging some aspect of the world. And again, it could be a work of art. It could be, like Hopkins, it could be the outdoors. But it is, it's a wonderful way to bring in the senses, to bring in the imagination, to bring story, to do something, to make something with your hands. It's a wonderful exercise, the Commonplace Book. On your feet. Okay, oddly, these students aren't literally on their feet. But I'm sure you've discovered this as teachers. Say you're teaching Shakespeare, as I used to do with high school students. Yeah, I can have them sit in their little rows, and I can teach them what iambic pentameter is and all the rhetorical devices that you can find in Julius Caesar and blah, 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 blah. And I can just all be left hemisphere mode about Shakespeare. Or I can say, at least at the beginning, get up! We're going to put on costumes and we're going to act this out. Right? And sometimes you can do it just very spontaneously in the classroom with the text in their hands, so no memorization is required. Though I used to do, as a culminating text with freshmen, we would read A Midsummer Night's Dream, and they would have I would put them in little film companies, I would call them, and they would have weeks to prepare. So they would memorize their parts. They would prepare costumes. So I had a lot of bottoms, horses' heads. We would go out into the woods and we would film the scenes. And of course, they have a movie studio in their pocket on their iPhone. So they would go home and they would edit these. They would put music on. And then we would have a day where we would watch them. Fabulous. Shakespeare comes to life. So it doesn't have to be with Shakespeare, but finding some way to put a text, and not just a literary text, in action on your feet. I've had pre-Socratic philosophers in character debating in my college classroom, right? It's the same principle involved. Imitation exercises, as I've said, I do an exercise with my freshmen where they write an imitation Platonic dialogue. That's the first page of the rubric there. It's a guided process. I don't just say, go write an imitation. But it's sort of I hold their hand through the process. When they take my human nature course, they do an imitation exercise of an article from St. Thomas's Summa, right? Imitation exercises, that's, you can always find an example, no matter what the discipline, to do an exercise like that. I love Wonder Walks. Those are my freshmen on the first day of school last August. So they're all fresh and squeaky clean. And I put them on what I call a Wonder Walk. Beautiful day in Virginia. They're not just out there strolling. They're with a partner. They're talking philosophy, right? Wonder walks are what I call, after Aristotle's nickname, the peripatetic, which means, the person who likes to walk around. Aristotle would walk around Athens with his students, right? So they become peripatetikoi, those who walk around talking philosophy, right? So they're out there in the beauty of the day, they're making a new friend, they're doing something fun. I have students years later, when they're getting ready to graduate, say, oh, Dr. McInerny, I always remember when we did the Wonder Walk on that first day. That's what stays with them, right? Here's something a little bit more analytic. The Socratic Seminar. If you don't know this exercise, just briefly, it's when the students have a discussion between themselves about whatever topic. Doesn't really matter what the discipline is. And the way I learned it, the students sit in a circle, and you can see there's an outer circle as well, where the students sit behind one another, and the students in the outer circle kind of take notes on the student right in front of them. But the heart of it is for them simply to have a conversation. I, as a professor, wouldn't get involved except maybe to offer a new question, but then I back off. Now, you might wonder, how is that so poetic? Because they're doing really left hemisphere mode kind of work there. They're defining, distinguishing, making arguments, yes, but the act of having a live conversation with their peers, that's the poetic part. That's what energizes them, right? If I just stand there in lecture format and say, can you give me a definition of a horse, right? There's not going to be much energy in the room. But if I put them in Socratic seminar format, the energy, the poetic energy increases. Last one. This I take from an odd source, the Catholic novelist, philosopher, medical doctor, Walker Percy. That's him on the right. You may know Percy has a book of essays called The Message in the Bottle. And there is an essay in there called The Loss of the Creature. And it's about more than one thing, but at a certain point he starts talking about high school teaching. And he makes the point that if you really want the student's mind to come alive, he says, ideally what you need is their city to be bombed, right? That's what you need, because when your life is in jeopardy, all of reality suddenly, all reality becomes poetic like that, right? every experience becomes vivid and is touching the heart. Okay, but short of someone bombing your city, what you need to do is you need to switch the context. Surprise the students with a new context. So Percy, I think only half-jokingly says, what you want them to do is to dissect the dogfish in English class, and you want them to read Shakespeare in their biology class. We'd have to think more about how to execute that. But the point is, you want to disrupt the conventional patterns of learning. The sitting in the very well-ordered rows, lecture format, writing on the whiteboard, put this in your notebook, there'll be a quiz on Friday. You're upsetting all that. And you're putting it in a new context. I think that's wonderful. Okay. So these are some key texts that I think can be helpful to you as you think more about how to make poetic experience real in your classroom. I won't comment upon them all. I'll come back to this slide in case you want to write something down. I'll just give a word. If you don't know Scott Newstock's book, How to Think Like Shakespeare, do you know that book? It's a wonderful book. I find it very inspiring for my own teaching. I'll come back to this slide. But I'll end by simply re-emphasizing what Pope Benedict calls the pressing need of our time, to rediscover poetic experience and to find that beauty in poetic experience is what is going to save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. McInerny. That was fantastic. Absolutely. So we're going to break for lunch now. We'll be back at 1:15 for our breakout sessions, and then right after that, we'll hear from Dr. Serrallo. Okay, thanks.